Before the sun rises, before the earth stirs, before the first call of the desert wind, there is only breath. You're slow and steady, as if the night itself is exhaling through you. The world is still dark, but not silent. Footsteps in the dust, the soft rustle of linen, the distant splash of water poured into a clay basin. You are not dreaming, you're remembering. Remembering a place built not by kings, but by hands like yours. A world where days begin in silence and end in stone, where every hour is marked not by clocks, but by the weight of the work and the rhythm of the sun. You are in Egypt now, thousands of years ago. In the golden hush of morning, the sand is cool beneath your feet. The stars are fading above and far beyond the hills. Pyramid waits not as a monument, but as a promise. Come now. Let the dust settle. Let the world slow. Let the story begin. The air was still dark when I opened my eyes. It wasn't the sun that woke MIT, never was. It was the sound of footsteps, sand shifting under sandals. The quiet mutter of men already outside their huts, stretching, coughing, moving like ghosts. In the blue-gray dawn, my bones ached before I even sat up. The mat I slept on was little more than woven reeds. It left patterns on my back. I rubbed my face, blinked through the haze of sleep, and smelled the sour breath of the man who had shared the corner of the room beside me. Outside, a rooster crowed. Somewhere in the near distance, a water jug toppled and shattered, and someone cursed under his breath in the language of the laborer, half prayer, half profanity. This was how every day began. Not with gold, not with magic. It's just sore muscles. In the shuffling rhythm of men preparing for a long walk toward stone, I tied my belt and stepped into the light, which was not quite light yet. A ribbon of pale orange split the eastern sky, caught between the desert's dunes and the edge of the rising Nile mist. Already the heat was building beneath the cool air. It was a trick the sun played every morning, promising mercy, then delivering fire. We walked in quiet clusters, some still yawning, others chewing the last of the onions they had saved from the night before. Our village was a sprawl of mud brick homes and communal huts, close enough to the pyramid site that we could see its silhouette against the sky. It was only half finished, yet already towering like a sleeping god with sharp shoulders. We were not slaves, not in the way the old legends would one day say. We were workers builders, sons of farmers, conscripts, craftsmen, volunteers. The government gave us rations, shelter, a place in history. Though few of us believed in legacy, we believed in bread and rest. In the long, slow march from sunrise to shade, what glory was there in lifting stone and sweating beneath the gaze? A foreman who barked orders with the sharp edge of copper whips in their voices, and yet there was pride too, strange, quiet pride. That we could move mountains, shape them into the bones of a god-king's dream, not crumble beneath their weight. Our day began with stone. It always did. Before the sun crested the cliffs behind us, we were already hauling the first blocks from the staging ground. Great square monsters, carved in the distant quarries and ferried across the Nile on barges. It took many hands, ropes thick as fists, wooden sleds greased with water or oil to drag them. The sound was terrible stone screaming against wood, men grunting like oxen, sand shifting like waves beneath us. We leaned forward, legs bent, bodies braced and pulled. Sometimes the stone did not move for minutes, only mocking us as we strained. Then, suddenly, with a jolt and a groan, it would give. We cheered. We always did, no matter how tired we were. That first lurch forward brought a strange kind of joy. Progress. By midday, the heat was unbearable. The sun stood directly above us, a cruel overseer with no shadow. Sweat soaked our linen kilts. Our backs shined with salt. We drank from clay jugs passed hand to hand, warm water with the taste of clay and dust. Meals were simple flatbread, onions, maybe some lentils, or dates if we were lucky. Some days there was fish, dried and salted, carried in from the Nile on reed trays. We ate quickly, sitting under the thin shade of scaffoldings or between boulders that had not yet been shaped. The dust was everywhere, on our fingers, in our noses, between our teeth. No matter how we wiped or washed, it clung to us a second. Skin, a builder's mark. The foreman walked among us, scribes by their sides, taking notes on rolls of papyrus, who had shown up on time, who had not, who worked hardest, who'd faltered. The records would last longer than we would. I often wondered if they'd remember my name, or just the number by it. We were replaceable, after all. The pyramid cared little for the hands that built it. It only cared for the vision of the man, entombed beneath its rising spine, but not all the work was brute strength. Some men carved, some smoothed. I was one of them. After the morning haul, I took my place with the block polisher's men who spent hours kneeling or crouched beside stone, grinding its face into perfection with copper tools and sand paste. The noise was different here, not the thunder of pulled sleds, but the hiss of stone on stone, the rhythm of hands rubbing endlessly. We spoke little, our fingers bled sometimes. Calluses grew, broke, and returned. But when the light struck the finished face of a block, and it gleamed, almost white, there was pride again. We had tamed it, taken the jagged, broken face of raw earth and made it smooth, worthy of the afterlife. By the time the sun dipped low enough to cast long shadows over our sight, we slowed. Not because we wanted to, because our bodies demanded it. Muscles trembled. Feet swelled in their sandals. Some men sat wherever they could. Others lay flat in the sand, not caring about the dirt or the ants or the flies. Rest was sacred, I found. My usual place, a sliver of shade between two half-set blocks, and lay back, hands behind my head, eyes closed, listening to the hum of flies and the laughter of men who still had the energy to joke. They said tomorrow the priest would bless the eastern side, that a new ramp would be built, that someone had stolen a jar of beer from the storeroom and hidden it behind the latrine, that one of the master builders had collapsed from the heat. I did not care much. I was too tired to listen. Evening brought relief. The winds picked up, carrying a little of the river's breath with them. The foremen blew their horns. The work paused. Some men sang on the walk back. Others limped. My shoulders felt like stone. My knees buckled with each step. We returned not as men, but as empty skins filled with ache. Inside the village, smoke curled from cooking fires. The scent of roasted onions, garlic, and lentils clung to the air. We washed our hands and feet, scooped water over our heads, sat in circles with our brothers. We told stories, some true, some exaggerated, all of them necessary. Laughter was medicine. So was silence. That night, the stars came out bright. There was no moon. Just the shimmer of 1,000 points of light over the dark pyramid skeleton. I looked at it from my doorway, eating my last piece of bread, chewing slowly, letting my jaw rest between bites. The desert was quiet, save for the distant sound of drums from another workers' camp, down the slope. Someone sang a low song. In a language older than King's, it reminded me of my mother's voice, though I hadn't seen her in many seasons. I lay down. The mat still rough, my body still sore, but there was a strange comfort in the repetition, a rhythm to it. Not a curse, just a cycle. We build today, build tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. We live in the shadow of something greater than ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, when the world forgets our names, it will still remember. Our work. I closed my eyes, dust in my hair, salt on my skin, and dreams full of stone. The night did not last long. Sleep in the laborers' quarters came in fragments, stolen minutes between the shifting bodies, to groans of bruised ribs, and the occasional outburst of laughter from the young ones who still held energy in their bones. I awoke once in the dark to the sound of someone whispering a prayer, not loud enough to wake others, just the low murmur of a man bargaining with his gods for strength, for a painless back, for a day without failure. Then silence again, as even hope turned inward. When the morning came, it came fast. The sky went from indigo to silver in moments, and before long, the foreman's horns blew from across the worker village, That sound sharp, vibrating, final meant there was no more time to delay. The sun had not yet cleared the hills, but the day was already beginning, and so we rose. Some men limped from old injuries. Others clutched their shoulders, rubbed their necks, tested their grip strength with quiet anxiety. We all did it. We knew the stones didn't care. They would wait for no one. They had waited already for millennia in the quarry. Now that they were awake and moving, they demanded attention. There was a moment I always dreaded the first time I had to lift anything. It reminded my body of all the pain it thought it had escaped overnight. Even just picking up the coiled rope or a mallet felt like punishment, but slowly motion became habit, and habit dulled pain. That was the trick. You couldn't think too much. Just move, breathe, haul, push. The body became a machine, powered by bread, onions, and the stubborn refusal to be bested by stone. Today we worked on the middle tiers. The scaffolds had been raised high. Ramps of limestone chippings stretched up like rivers of white sand, slick with grease and water. The team was different than the ground crew. Here it was the finishers and fitters, the ones who laid the blocks and checked the joints, who filled gaps with crushed stone and mortar. It was delicate work, precise, and slow. A single bad placement could skew the line of a whole section. I respected these men. They were not just laborers, they were craftsmen, masons of the old way, their knowledge handed from father to son, through gesture more than speech. I watched an older man, his back bent like a question mark, run his fingers. Across the edge of a block, he didn't speak. He just scraped a line with a copper pick, then nodded once. That was the sign. The stone could stay. Another team moved it into place with padded levers and chocks of wood. There was almost a poetry to its stone dancing. If stone could dance, locked into rhythm by muscle and mind. From up here, the view was different. You could see the whole desert unfurling like a golden sea. The Nile in the distance shimmered like a snake in sunlight, bending around the palm-lined banks and disappearing behind the hills. You could see the smaller pyramids already completed, their polished caps flashing in the light, the temple's rows of pillars casting perfect shadows, the bones of gods etched in relief along their walls. It was humbling. You felt small, but also proud to be part of it. Even a speck of dust in this great design was still part of the monument, but humility did not lighten the work. The heat returned by mid-morning, and up here, there was no shade. The white stone reflected the sun back at you from every angle. It cooked your skin, blinded your eyes, and dried your throat. Men tied rags across their heads, licked with lids half closed, blinking against the brightness. I saw one man. Faint, just dropped like a sack of grain. We poured water on him, fanned his face, whispered his name. He woke eventually, eyes rolling, and laughed. A dry, cracked laugh. We helped him sit. He would not be back for days. By midday we came down to eat. The climb was slow, aching. We washed at the trough's low stone basins filled from the well. The water always warm, always slightly bitter. The food was the same as yesterday and the day before. Bread, onions. Sometimes leeks or garlic if there had been a delivery from the state farms. I chewed slowly, not out of savoring, but necessity. My teeth hurt from grinding them. My jaw clicked with every bite. But the food was fuel. Without it, the body gave out. If the body gave out, there was no more purpose. After the meal, we were allowed to rest. Not long. Just enough to catch the breath that morning had stolen. I found my usual place beneath a leaning slab and laid my head against a wrapped bundle of linen. I didn't sleep, not really, just closed my eyes and let the sounds around me blur in talking, flies buzzing, the low groan of stone being moved somewhere far above. I thought of home, of the reed fields near the village where I was born, of my sister's wedding, of the smell of boiled barley and coriander in my mother's kitchen. The past seemed like a dream now, another life. Quieter, simpler. But it did not call me back. This was my place now between the blocks and the sun. In the shadow of a future tomb, when the rest ended, we returned to the ramp. More hauling, more shouting. The foremen were relentless today. eager to finish a critical row before the week's end. Their voices echoed across the stone, sharp as copper blades. Some men cracked under it. One shouted back and was taken away. Not whipped at least not in front of us, but removed. Maybe to another team, maybe dismissed, maybe worse. We did not ask. Discipline was part of the job. So was silence. The sun slid lower, casting golden shadows across the unfinished flanks of the pyramid. We worked in that light. Something about it made the stone seem alive, glowing with memory. It was easier to believe then in the stories. The priest told that these pyramids were not tombs, but ladders to the afterlife. That each block we placed was a step the soul of the king would climb to reach the sky. I did not always believe, but I liked the thought. It made the pain feel sacred. By late afternoon, my hands had blistered. The bandages I wore had frayed. My knuckles were raw from catching on ropes. Still, I kept moving. We all did. There was no glory in quitting, only shame. You could rest when the sun touched the horizon and the horn sounded again. And when it did, finally, mercifully, we dropped our tools and stretched our aching limbs. Each of us slower than we'd been that morning. The walk back was longer than usual. My legs dragged, my heels stung with every step. The boy offered me water from his jug. I nodded thanks and drank deeply. He was younger than the rest of us, barely past his first beard, but already with the shoulders of a man. He would go far. Maybe one day he'd be a foreman. Maybe he'd die here beneath a block, like others had. No one could say. The stones chose their own stories. Back in camp, the firelight warmed our faces as the sky turned violet. A few men sang low, rhythmic songs with half-remembered words. Someone played a pipe, a reed whistle, high and thin, cut through the dusk like a bird's cry. We passed food again. Fish today, a surprise? Tough but welcome. I ate slowly, watching. The sparks rise from the fire. My body still ached, but the pain had dulled into something familiar, like an old companion you'd stopped arguing with. That night, the wind came from the west, carrying the scent of the river. I lay on my mat and stared at the stars. They seemed closer here, more real. I wondered if the king looked at them before. He died, if he had feared the dark, or if he had known, as we did, that the work never ended, not even in death. That the pyramid would rise over his bones like a promise kept, and tomorrow we would do it all again. The next morning, the horn blew before I even opened my eyes. I was already awake, lying in the blue half-dark, staring at the woven roof of the hut as the breath of morning seeped through the cracks. I hadn't slept well. My shoulder burned. From where I'd braced a block yesterday, and there had been a dream, one of those strange, lingering dreams that stays in your chest rather than your mind. I couldn't remember the details, only that it had something to do with water and my father's voice calling my name from the riverbank. When I sat up, the mat was damp with sweat, and my hands were already curled, as if gripping a rope that wasn't there. Outside, the sky was the color of ash. A dusty breeze stirred the air, and for a brief moment, I could smell the distant sweetness of date palms. The camp was already in motion. Men wrapping linen around their waists, some grumbling, some laughing quietly at a joke shared only by early risers. The night cook was packing away the clay pots. I could still see the black circle. On the ground where the fire had burned, we moved like gears in a giant machine, each of us, a tooth in the wheel. And the wheel never stopped turning. At the water trough, I splashed my face and took a few gulps. It was warm already, but it helped clear my head. The foremen paced near the edge of the road, checking their rosters. I saw one scribe pause, squint, at his papyrus scroll, and mutter something to his assistant. I wondered if my name had been marked, if I'd been noticed yesterday, for good or for bad. You never knew what was written down, or how far up those notes would travel. The walk to the pyramid was longer than usual. It's not in distance, but in effort. The desert felt heavy, the wind low and sluggish. It was as though the earth itself didn't want to move. A strange silence sat over the group. Even the birds, those little sand-colored doves that flitted from boulder to boulder, seemed to be watching us with unnatural stillness. Someone said a storm was coming, that they had seen strange clouds out by the western escarpment. I glanced toward the hills, but saw only heat shimmering. Still, I felt it too, that tension in the air, like something waiting to break. Today I was assigned to the north face. A new layer was going up, and it was dangerous work. We had to haul the blocks up a narrow ramp that curved around the slope like a serpent's back. It's one wrong step, and you could fall. One loose rope, and the block would crush your leg. Everyone moved with care. The foreman on this side was younger than the others, barely older than me, but with sharp eyes and no tolerance for idleness. He barked often, walked fast, and never smiled. Some said he was the son of a priest. Others said he'd been raised near the necropolis and had seen too much death to laugh anymore. Still, he knew the work. Under his direction, the line moved. Smoothly, ropes were fastened quickly. Levers placed with precision. Blocks raised inch by inch, each movement timed like a breath. I admired him, even if I feared him. In this place, fear and respect were the same shape. By mid-morning, the sun was merciless. The wind had died completely. Every breath felt like inhaling through cloth. My kilt was soaked through. My fingers, wrapped in linen for grip, had turned wrinkled and soft, like river reeds left too long in the water. And yet we worked. What else could we do? This was our life. To pause was to be noticed. And to be noticed was not always a blessing. During the midday break, I found a spot in the shade of the limestone ramp and closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep. My stomach churned. Not from hunger. I'd eaten my share of bread and lentils, but from something else. A tightness. A worry I couldn't name. Around me, the others were quieter than usual. One man, older than the rest, sat beside me and unwrapped a small bundle of cloth. Inside was a dried lotus flower. He placed it in the crook of his knee and stared at it for a long time. "My son used to bring me these," he said without looking at me, "before he was conscripted to the quarries. It's been gone 6 seasons now. I think about him every time the wind shifts." He didn't say anything more, just folded the cloth again and tucked it away. I nodded, unsure what to say. There was no comfort in words, only the shared silence of men with stories too heavy to carry aloud. When we returned to work, the north ramp groaned under the weight of a new delivery. The block was larger than the others, possibly meant for one of the upper chambers. It took 30 men to move it. I was part of the rear push. My hands against the slick wooden sled, thighs braced, back curved, eyes locked on the feet of the man in front of me. "Push!" the foreman shouted, and we did. The sled creaked forward, sand shifted, a rope snapped, someone cried out. The block lurched and stopped. We froze, breath held. Then, slowly, carefully, the foreman adjusted the ropes, checked the tension, and gave the signal again. Push, strain, groan, inch by inch. The block moved up the slope like a reluctant animal. When it reached the platform, we collapsed onto the stone, chests heaving, hands trembling, but no one was hurt. Not this time. Later, as I helped set the block in place, I caught sight of the pyramid's shadow stretching across the valley below. It looked like a dark blade, slicing through the sand. I wondered what it would be like when it was finished, when the capstone was set. When the polished limestone glinted so bright it could blind a man, would we still be here? Or would new men take our place, telling stories about the ones who had come before? By the time the sun tilted westward, the foreman gave the order to stop, a rare mercy. She said the heat was too dangerous now. Someone had collapsed on the south face. We packed our tools. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely tie the rope around the sled's corner. Another man helped me. He didn't speak, just tightened the knot with a nod. The walk home was quiet. Dust clung to our ankles. My feet felt like stones. My throat burned, and I longed for water, not the warm clay taste from the trough, but real water, cool and sweet, the kind you only dreamed about. I thought again of my dream from last night, my father calling from the river. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew I missed his voice. That evening, as the stars emerged, I sat, alone for a while outside the hut. The others were already gathering around the fire, laughing softly, trading scraps of food and gossip. But I needed a moment. A pause. I looked up at the sky and thought about the priests, the ones who said that every man had a ka, a soul shadow, that watched over him in life and traveled to the field of reeds and death. I wondered where my ka was. If it watched me now, crouched in the sand, covered in sweat and dust. If it pitied me, or if it stood, arms folded, nodding in approval. Later I joined the others. Someone had managed to trade for beer thick, bitter, fermented in clay jars. It was rough, but it eased the soreness. We drank in silence, passing the jug from hand to hand. Across the fire, the old man with the lotus flower began to hum a song, a slow tune full of long vowels and soft consonants. The kind of song you didn't sing, you just remembered I laid down before the fire burned out. The coals crackled softly. The stars shifted overhead. Somewhere beyond the hills, a jackal cried out. Listened to it, eyes half closed, and thought. Of stone, of weight, of legacy, of tomorrow. And then I slept, and the wheel turned again. I woke with a jolt before the horn, sudden snap in my neck, as if the weight of yesterday's labor had followed me into sleep and twisted my spine in the dark. My mouth was dry, my back stuck to the mat. For a moment I just stared up at the low roof, breath shallow, ears filled with the distant hush of early wind blowing across the dunes. I could already tell it was going to be one of those days. The kind where the sun shows no mercy, where the dust clings harder, where the tools feel heavier, and where your body forgets what rest ever meant. When the horn finally did blow, it felt like an insult. I was already awake, already sore, already moving. I rolled to my feet, bones cracking in protest, and tied my linen at the waist. The hut smelled of old sweat, crushed straw, and heat that never quite left during the night. One of the younger men muttered something about skipping the morning wash. "It's pointless," he said. "We'll be filthy before the sun is even up." But still I went to the trough. Habit is harder to break than bone. The water was warm. My hands trembled as I cupped it, splashing my face, rubbing the back of my neck. A few others stood silently nearby, repeating the same ritual. We never spoke during the wash. It was the only part of the day that still felt sacred, private, even among many, as though the water carried not just the dust, but the memories of yesterday, and to leave unwashed was to carry them into today like a curse. The walk to the pyramid site was sluggish, not because we were late, but because we all felt a deep fatigue wrapped around our ankles like chains. Someone coughed. Someone else dragged his feet until a foreman cracked his voice like a whip, reminding us that the stone would not move itself. That was always their favorite line. Heard it so often it had become almost invisible like a whisper on the wind. But it was true. The stones waited for no man. They did not care how tired we were. They did not care who bled or broke. Today, I was back at the base of the Foundation cruise. We were reinforcing an older layer that had shifted slightly from last. Weak storms. A slow job. Heavy. It meant lifting smaller blocks into tight corners, prying them into place with levers, packing the gaps with slurry and rubble, then smoothing the seams with sandstone and sweat. I preferred this work to hauling, but only at least here, I didn't fear being crushed. Just buried slowly, quietly, beneath the weight of repetition. Next to me, a boy no older than 15 struggled to lift a stone. His arms shook. His face was already slick with sweat. He dropped it once, picked it up, dropped it again. I moved beside him without a word and lifted one side. Together, we pushed it into place. He nodded once. I nodded back. We said nothing. That's how things work down here. Speech was for those who weren't exhausted. As the sun rose, the sand around us began to shimmer. Every surface turned white-hot. Even the shade beneath the pyramid's edge felt like a furnace. My tunic stuck to my back. My knees throbbed. I could feel the blisters from yesterday reopening. Still, we worked. The rhythm of it was almost hypnotic. Lift place. Smooth, check, lift again. Over and over until your arms stopped listening. and your thoughts wandered off without you. During a short break, I sat near the scaffolding posts and closed my eyes. A man beside me chewed on a dried fig. I could smell its sweetness. He tore it in half and handed me the rest. I accepted it without thanks. He didn't expect any. That was how generosity worked out here. Quiet, wordless, and rare. In the distance, a group of priests walked along the edge of the plateau, their linen robes snapping in the wind. They stopped occasionally, pointing toward the rising pyramid, muttering to one another, blessings maybe, or measurements, or arguments about angles only they understood. One of them held a long reed pen and gestured toward the horizon. I wondered what they saw when they looked at our work. A holy monument? A house for the dead? Or just geometry wrapped in ritual? I didn't know, and to be honest, I didn't care anymore. For us, the pyramid was not myth or majesty. It was calloused. Palms and sore joints and dreams interrupted by cramps. It was the creak of rope and the groan of stone and the soft thud of feet on sand. Whatever it was for the priests, it would never be that for us. By midday, the dust storm finally hit it. Came without warning, a sharp gust, then another, then a sudden wall of grit that rolled over the camp like smoke. We scattered, pulling cloth over our mouths, turning our backs to the wind. The foremen shouted, but their voices vanished into the roar. The sky turned the color of bronze. I could barely see my own hands. I crouched beside a stone slab and waited, eyes closed, as the wind stabbed my skin with 1,000 invisible needles. It lasted maybe half an hour, maybe longer. Time doesn't move the same inside a storm. When it finally passed, the air was thick with silence, the kind that settles after chaos. Dust coated everything: tools, skin, hair. Even the blocks themselves looked older, buried beneath a film of yellow sand. Some men coughed. One wept. Another just sat, staring at the sky as if it had betrayed him. The work paused. For once, the foreman agreed. We were told to rest until the wind returned to its usual whisper. I found a spot beneath the ruined tarp and sat with the boy from earlier. He said his name was Sephi. His brother worked in the copper mines. Her mother, he said, made charms for travelers' beads wrapped in linen, soaked in oil pressed against her forehead for luck. He gave me one. I didn't ask for it, but he insisted. It smelled faintly of myrrh and salt. I tied it around my wrist, not because I believed, but because he did. The wind eventually died. The sun returned. And with it, the day's last hours of work. We moved slower now. The heat doubled after the storm. Our strength halved. I rubbed the sand from my eyes and returned to the wall, shoulders screaming with each push, legs wobbling beneath the effort. Yeah, but I kept going, we all did. That was the unspoken oath between us. You push until you can't, and then you push. More by the time the sun began to sink, the pyramid cast its long shadow again. We stood within it, pale silhouettes against its base, like insects caught beneath the foot of a giant. The horn blew, dropped our tools. One exhaled loud enough to be heard across the field. A few men clapped each other on the back. A few collapsed where they stood. The walk back was quiet. The wind carried the scent of tamarisk trees. My legs shook with each step. The camp fires had already been lit. The pots bubbled with barley and lentils. I took my bowl and sat with Sephi. He ate like a man starved, ate like a man too tired to chew. Round us, the voices of other workers rose into the night songs. Jokes, arguments, soft prayers. Someone drummed on a pot with a wooden ladle. The rhythm reminded me of heartbeats. That night, I didn't lie on my mat. I stayed outside, watching the stars, listening to the desert breathe. The pyramid loomed in the distance, half covered in dust, half lit by moonlight. A great silent thing, timeless, patient, as if waiting for someone else to finish. What we had only begun. I thought of my mother, of her hands always smelling of bread and oil, of the lullabies she used to hum when I was small. I closed my eyes and tried to hear her voice in the wind, and for a moment I did. Then sleep came, and I let it take me. The next day arrived not as a beginning, but as a continuation. Nothing felt new, not the sky, not the aching in my legs, not the taste of dry bread stuck to the roof of my mouth. Time didn't pass. Here it pressed, slowly like the stone itself. Inching forward without permission, I rose before the horn again. It wasn't pride or duty. My body simply woke me. The stiffness in my spine acted like an alarm, reminding me that I had work to do, whether I wanted to or not. Outside, the sand was cold. The stars still glimmered faintly, holding their place above the silhouette of the rising pyramid. Stillness. I could hear everything: the creak of wood in the scaffolds, the distant cough of a foreman already preparing his ledgers, the low murmur of men speaking softly in the shadows, trading stories from dreams they have remembered. I moved quietly to the water trough, and again, without words, the ritual begins. Plash, rub, spit, breathe. That cold water felt like permission, silent contract between me and the day. When the horn finally did cry out across the village, we were already moving. Tools were gathered, linen belts tied, heads wrapped, sandals tested for fraying. Some men offered a quick prayer to Thoth or to Ra, others only muttered under their breath. As for me, did neither. My reverence, if I had any, belonged not to gods but to rhythm. I believed in movement, in habit, in the strange holiness of repetition. Today I was sent to the western slope. The wind was stronger there, coming off the desert, carrying whispers of far-off dunes. I welcomed it. The breeze kept the heat away just long enough to lift a few more stones before my skin began to sting. I worked alongside an older man named Hetty. He had a bent back and a voice like stone grinding against stone. He didn't say much unless he had something to teach, and when he did speak, you listened. "You see this groove?" he said, pointing to a block we were setting into place. "This is where the gods sit." I frowned. The gods. He smirked without looking at me. "Not real ones. Not your Ra or your Osiris. I mean balance. Pressure. If the block doesn't sit right in its groove, the whole row turns crooked, and crooked rows make crooked pyramids. We're not building stairs for kings to trip on. We had a way of making everything sound like a joke and a warning at the same time." Liked that. There was something sacred in his sarcasm. It reminded me that even in this mountain of labor, we were allowed to laugh. Even if just quietly, we spent the morning setting stones, checking lines with strings soaked in red dye, tapping corners with polished pegs, and smoothing seams with oil and sand. There was a rhythm to it all, not fast, but precise, like the beat of a slow drum that never missed a strike. You didn't just build with your hands, you built with your eyes, your breath, your posture. Each stone placed was a choice, and choices lasted longer than the men who made them. Around midday, the wind shifted again. The breeze turned into a gust. The gust became a howl. We paused, tools raised, eyes scanning the sky. But it wasn't another sandstorm. It was just the desert's breath stirred awake by the heat. It carried the smell of fire pits and drying. Fish from the camps near the river. Strange how such a distant scent could make you hungry. I chewed on an onion and let the Thames fill my nose, hoping it would mask the fatigue that had begun to wrap itself around my lungs. Lunch was short. It always was. Time didn't stretch in our favor. We ate quickly flatbread, a smear of bean, paced a handful of lentils, water from a leather bag that tasted like yesterday's sweat. But still, we shared. Always. One man had a fig. He split it 3 ways. No one asked for more than they were given. In a world of stone, generosity became a kind of rebellion. After the meal, the foreman inspected our work. They walked slowly, their sandals whispering across the sanded platforms, papyrus rolls in hand. One of them paused at my block. He crouched, pressed his finger against the seam, frowned, said nothing, then stood and walked away. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. That was the test. No word was better than a bad word, and silence meant we had done our job. The afternoon dragged, as my arms felt like bone wrapped in fire. My hands were raw beneath the linen. I could feel the fibers fusing into my skin. I didn't stop. None of us did. Round me, the others kept moving like dancers in a slow, brutal ritual. The younger men strained and shouted. The older ones moved in silence, with economy, fewer steps, better choices. I tried to learn from them where to place my foot, how to angle the tool, when to rest, and when to push. At one point I dropped my mallet. My fingers simply let go. It clattered against the stone and rolled off the edge. I cursed softly. Sephi, the boy from before, climbed down and retrieved it without being asked. He handed it to me and smiled, his teeth white against his dust-covered face. "Your strength is in your shoulders," he said, "not your fingers. Don't blame them for letting go." I laughed. It was the first laugh I'd let out all day. By the end of the shift, the stone felt heavier than it had in the morning. I was sure it hadn't grown, but my muscles disagreed. When the horn sounded, it didn't feel like a call to rest. It felt like a rescue. We dropped our tools. Some men stretched their backs until they cracked. Others just lay down where they stood. I staggered to the edge of the ramp and sat, my legs swinging over the drop like a child at the riverbank. The wind had cooled, the sun was sliding behind the hills, and the pyramid cast its long, perfect shadow across the desert like a sundial, made for giants. As we walked back, the sky turned orange, then crimson, then violet. It was the kind of beauty you didn't speak about. You just let it sink into your skin. One man hummed a tune under his breath, one of those old river songs, passed from grandmother to grandson without ever being written down. I didn't know the words, but I knew the feeling. That was enough. In camp, the fires burned low. The food was simple barley porridge with garlic and salt. We ate without complaint. No one asked for seconds. There was a kind of peace in knowing. The meal matched the day. Humble, honest, enough. That night, I sat alone by the edge of camp, staring at the pyramid. It rose like a second moon in the dark, pale and sharp-edged, unfinished, but already eternal. I thought of all the men buried beneath it. Not the kings, the others, the forgotten. The ones who'd fallen during construction or during the haul or in their sleep from exhaustion too deep to wake from. I wondered if the pyramid remembered them, if it held their sweat in its seams, if it carried their names in the spaces between blocks. If so, then maybe it wasn't just a tomb for the king. Maybe it was a monument to all of us. I pressed the little charm from Sephi between my fingers. The one his mother had made, smelled faintly of the desert spice and sand and something else I couldn't name. I closed my eyes. I didn't pray. I didn't need to. The silence between thoughts was prayer enough. And then, as always, I slept. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. Because tomorrow would come, and with it, the stone. The sound that woke me wasn't the horn. It was my own breath, rasped, uneven, rasping through dry lips as though my lungs had tried to finish the work before I could. My body had stiffened in the night, curled around soreness like a man hugging a boulder in his sleep. When I sat up, the fire pit was cold, the stars pale against the coming light, and a thin coating of dust clung to everything: my arms, my mat, my bones. It was as if the desert had tried to claim me overnight and changed its mind by morning. I stood slowly, every joint reluctant. My knees popped, my back screamed. But I didn't groan. Groaning made it worse. Better to move silently, like the old men who had long since given up trying to fight their discomfort. Beside me, someone stirred. Sephi the boy slept with his mouth open, a slight snore escaping through cracked lips. I nudged him gently with my foot. He blinked, nodded, and sat up. No words? We didn't need them. Our movement spoke clearly enough. Time to rise. The pyramid is waiting at the trough. The water was colder than usual, almost sharp. I splashed it on my face and caught my reflection in the stone basin, a man half swallowed by dust, eyes sunken, lines deep around the corners of his mouth. I barely recognized myself anymore. The boy I had been, the one who laughed too loud at river markets and danced barefoot on harvest nights, was somewhere beneath the surface. Hidden like a name chiseled into sandstone and worn smooth by time, still there, but silent. We walked to the site under a copper sky. The sun hadn't yet breached the cliffs, but its presence was already felt in the rising warmth. the quiet that clung to us like a veil. The group today was smaller. Illness, injuries, exhaustion. Some men had not returned. No one asked questions. If a man didn't show up, you left his name behind like a dropped tool. If he came back, you made room. If he didn't, you carried one less story. Today, I was on the hauling team. Again. It was hard work, the kind that made your fingernails black and your knees unreliable. But something about it brought clarity. There was no finesse, no fine touch, just rope and leverage and brute endurance. The stone we moved was massive, at least the size of a small house. I couldn't tell where it had come from, only that it bore quarry marks I hadn't seen before. Fresh grooves, symbols carved into the edges to indicate placement, origin, perhaps even blessing. The scribe watched us from the ramp, his pen scratching. Along the papyrus as we lined up, the hall began with chants, not words, just rhythm. A deep, collective hum rising from the group like thunder rolling in a barrel. The chant didn't have meaning, but it had purpose to set the pace, kept our feet aligned, made the push a shared act rather than a solitary burden. We pulled. The ropes groaned. Sand crunched under the sled. Our feet sank, but we pushed harder, leaning with our entire weight as the block moved in inches, then stopped, then moved again. Every few feet we paused. Not long, just enough to adjust the ropes, wipe sweat from our brows, suck down a mouthful of air before the chant began again. I could feel the fibers of the rope biting into my palms, each tug deepening the grooves already there. But I didn't stop. None of us did. To stop was to falter. To falter was to be replaced. No one wanted to be replaced. By midday, the stone had made it halfway up the ramp. My tunic clung to my back like wet clay. My legs shook with every step. But the chant carried me. The beat of men working in unison, the grunts of shared struggle, the silence of determination. It became a kind of music. Not one you'd dance to, but one that sank into your blood and rewrote your rhythm from the inside. During the meal break, I sat with my back to the pyramid's base. The stone radiated heat. My mouth was too dry to eat more than a bite of bread. I chewed slowly, savoring the roughness against my tongue. Sefi offered me half a date. I took it, tore it in two, gave him back his share. We ate in silence. Ate. Not. From rudeness, from reverence. There was talk today, low whispers about a worker who had collapsed yesterday on the southern face and hadn't been seen since. Some said he'd been sent back to the village. Others claimed the body had been quietly buried beneath unused stone, wrapped in linen and salt. No ritual, no offering, just dust to dust. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. In the afternoon, I was reassigned to the upper platform final placement work. The view was staggering. The land fell away on all sides, stretching into distance and haze. You could see the thread of the Nile cutting the earth like a ribbon of dark glass. I stood there a moment, not moving, letting the wind press against my chest. Up here, the air was different, thinner, but cleaner. We laid stone with careful hands, each block tapped into place with wooden mallets, guided by ink lines and the gentle correction of master fitters. These were men who didn't speak unless it was about the stone. They had worked on temples, tombs, causeways, shrines. Their hands moved with grace, their eyes saw things I couldn't. I followed their lead. When one of them nodded at my joint line and said, simply, "Good," I felt the warmth of that word settle into my ribs like a kindling fire. By the time the final horn blew, I had lost all feeling in my fingers. My body had entered that strange, quiet state beyond pain and numbness that came only when your limbs gave up trying to protest. I walked back with Sefi. He told me a story about a woman who lived in the hills and could speak to jackals. He said she once whispered a secret into a dying man's ear, and he lived 3 more years. I asked what the secret was. He shrugged. No one ever remembers. That's how you know it's real. Back at camp, the fire felt hotter than usual. Maybe because the night was colder. Maybe because my skin had thinned. I ate quickly, said little. I slept on my back, staring at the stars, thinking not of gods or kings, but of grooves in stone, of the feel of rope against skin, of the strange. Music made by feet dragging across sand, and in the silence before sleep I thought, I have become part of it. It's not just the labor, the shape. The pyramid was no longer something I worked on. It was something I belonged to, maybe in some quiet, unknowable way it belonged to me too. It rained once, a long time ago. It's just a light mist over the sand, like the gods had spilled a cup while passing overhead. The ground hissed when it touched, and the men stood in silence, arms raised, watching the sky as though they'd forgotten. How clouds worked, it lasted only a few minutes, but they talked about it for weeks afterward, how the dust changed color, how the stones shimmered differently, how the smell of wet limestone seemed to reach back into something older than all of us. I think of that day sometimes, in the mornings, when the air feels heavier than it should, as though the memory of water still floats just above our heads, watching us lift, haul, stack, repeat. This morning the heat came early. The sun had barely cleared the cliffs, and already it clung to the skin. It was a pressing warmth, not yet. Cruel but firm like a taskmaster's hand resting on your shoulder before the whip. I woke with sand in my mouth. Sephi had rolled off his mat and was lying on his side, one leg still twitching from a dream. I didn't wake him. He'd rise when his body demanded it. We all did. No one woke to the sound of joy here. We rose because the day left no choice. I dressed slower than usual, letting the stiffness of sleep work itself out of my joints as I wrapped the cloth around my waist and shoulders. My hands were swollen, my fingertips raw. The rope burns had thickened into small ridges. I touched one absently, as if trying to remember when it first appeared. But that was the trick, there was no first. The pain had always been there. Simply changed shape. The foreman's horn blew, thin and sharp across the breeze. I grabbed my tool bag and walked. No conversation. Just the crunch of sandals on dry dirt, the sound of dozens of feet tracing the same trail as the day before. And the day before that, a slow migration from rest to labor, like cattle returning to a feeding ground that gave no nourishment. Today we were reinforcing the edge stones of the northern face. They had shifted slightly just enough to catch the attention of the surveyors, who paced back and forth along the perimeter with plumb lines and chalk. One had marked the fault with a red stripe, and now it was our job to fix it. "Don't think," one of the older men said as we began. "Stone knows when you hesitate." It was a strange thing to say, but I understood it. The work demanded certainty. Hesitation cracked things, fingers, joints, confidence. The platform was narrow, the drop steep. I knelt and began smoothing mortars between the joints, pressing it in with short strokes of the trowel, wiping excess with the flat edge of a palm. My body worked without guidance now. Every movement came from memory. I didn't have to think about how to apply pressure, how to brace my knee, how to keep the sand out of the mix. My body remembered. My body had become the tool. Around midday, a man from another crew collapsed. Didn't cry out. He just dropped. His body made a sound. I'll never forget, not a thud, not a crash, just a soft surrender. We stopped. Even the foreman. The nearest men gathered around. Someone pressed a damp cloth to his face. Another fanned him with their tunic. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open. He tried to sit, failed, and lay back down. They carried him off the ramp on a makeshift litter made from 2 poles and a piece of canvas. No one said anything, but everyone moved a little slower after that. The pyramid does not forgive weakness, but it does remember it. I returned to the mortar work in silence, glancing now and then at the place where the man had fallen. The wind picked up in the afternoon, curling around the edges of the scaffolding and lifting little spirals of dust. It was a dry, ghostly breeze, the kind that made your eyes squint even before the grit touched them. I pulled the cloth tighter over my head and kept working. Later, during a brief rest, I found myself beside one of the fitters, an older man with a long scar running across his shoulder blade. He didn't speak much, but today he offered me a date from a small cloth bundle tied to his belt. I accepted it gratefully. The sweetness shocked my tongue. I chewed slowly, letting it dissolve like medicine. He watched me for a moment, then said, "Every block we place is a story. Not ours, the king's. but it still told through our hands. I didn't reply. I just nodded. That was enough. When the horn blew for day's end, I stayed behind. A little longer, brushing sand away from the corner joint I had been working on. Not out of perfection, out of stubbornness. I wanted to finish the seam before I let it go. A clean line. My mark. My mark. I stood up slowly, bones creaking, and looked back at the pyramid from the platform's edge. From this height, the base stretched endlessly, a jagged pattern of stone and shadow. The peak was still unfinished, but I could imagine how it would look when polished, how the capstone would shine in the sun like a piece of the sky had. Fallen and decided to stay. On the walk back, Sephi walked beside me, carrying 2 empty water jars slung across his back. He asked me why the priests always stayed clean, even in the dust. I told him they had their own troughs, their own cloth, their own gods. He nodded, then asked if we would become priests when the work was done. I smiled. No, I said. We'll just be men who built something too big to carry home. Thought about that for a while, then he asked if the pyramid would remember us. I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I wasn't sure whether I wanted it to. Back at camp, the fires glowed like old memories, familiar, warm, flickering with the same soft orange as every night before. The men sat in quiet clusters, eating, murmuring, dozing. Someone told a joke about a foreman with feet so large he cracked stones just by walking. Laughter came, tired, but real. Even in weariness, we found room for humor. It was all we had that didn't weigh anything. I ate slowly. My hands were too sore to hold the bowl properly. I balanced it on my knees and scooped with my fingers. The porridge was thin, but warm, salted, filling enough. The stars appeared gradually above us, blinking into life one by one, as if reluctant. To witness another night of the same, I lay down beside the fire with my arms folded beneath my head. Sephi curled up nearby, already asleep. The wind danced through the camp, stirring the smoke into spirals that rose toward the sky and vanished. I thought of my family of names I hadn't spoken in years, ate of a cousin who drowned during a flood, season of a sister who once carved her name into a clay pot and gave it to me before I left. The pot had broken long ago, but I remembered the shape of the letters. I remembered how her hands had looked small but sure, like a mason's hands in miniature. And just before sleep took me, I whispered something I hadn't said in a long time, not a wish, just my own name, softly to remind myself I was still here, that I hadn't vanished into the stone just yet. Morning rose again like a memory returning to the body. Didn't feel like the beginning of anything, just the continuation of a rhythm that no longer needed drums or horns or reason. I woke as if someone had wound me up in the night, a machine of muscle and breath, triggered by the faintest tremor of light through the reed roof. I didn't stretch, I didn't yawn, simply stood, found my sandals, and stepped into the chill of dawn. The camp was quiet, quieter than usual. The fire pits were down to ash. The scent of smoke lingered in the air like a forgotten dream. Sephi was already awake, sitting near the water trough with his knees pulled to his chest. He didn't speak, just nodded. That was enough. We were past words most mornings. There was nothing new to say. We had said it all already in the way we passed tools, shared bread, watched each other lift burdens too heavy for one man alone. The horn called us, like it always did, high and thin and final. It didn't sound harsh anymore, not to me. Sounded like permission, like a bell marking time in a world that had lost the need for clocks. I followed the others down the worn path toward the pyramid, the dust kicking up around our feet, rising into the air like memory. Today I worked alone for most of the morning, a side assignment. One of the outer walkways had shifted in the wind and needed reinforcement. I didn't mind the solitude. Sometimes it was good to hear only the scrape of tool on stone, the rhythm of your own breathing echoing in your chest. I worked slowly, methodically, pressing rubble into cracks, smoothing mortar, aligning the edge stones so the sun would strike them evenly at the right hour. There was something holy in the quiet. No chants, no grunts, just the occasional rustle. of wind in the scaffolding above, the soft scuff of my sandals as I shifted positions. I felt strangely at peace. My back still ached, my hands were still ruined, but the silence made the pain feel smaller, manageable, like I had become part of the pyramid's breath, folded into its rising geometry, no longer separate from its purpose. By midday, a runner brought word from the higher tiers. The capstone had arrived, not yet placed, but brought up from the sacred quarry, where the priests had washed it with palm water and marked its base with sigils of protection. Word traveled fast. Even those of us at the lowest levels felt the shift in energy. The work picked up speed, not from command, but from pride. This was the end game. The spine of the pyramid would soon be complete. And every man wanted to say he had touched the day that stone rose. I rejoined the main crew after the meal. The same faces, each one made harder by weeks of sun and labor. Sephi stood beside me now without being asked. He had grown stronger. His hands no longer shook when he gripped the rope. His voice had lowered, quieter, as if shaped by dust. He was becoming one of us, and I, perhaps, was becoming something else older than my years. My gaze often drifting toward the edge of the desert, as if searching for something I hadn't yet admitted. We hauled more blocks that afternoon. Smaller ones now, finishing pieces. They had to be precise. Even the irregular ones used to fill corners and hide transitions were carved with care. I found myself admiring the imperfections. The slight curve in a block's edge. The faint ripple where the copper chisel had trembled. They reminded me that even this eternal structure had been shaped by flawed hands. Hands like mine, the foremen were tense. He barked more today, pushed harder. I watched one scream at a man for fumbling a tool, only to stop mid-sentence and turn away, shame on his face. They felt it tooth end drawing near. The pressure of completion, of perfection. The capstone was a weight not just of stone, but of expectation. Evening came slower than usual. The sky was heavy with dust, muting the sunset into a wash of rust and violet. We sat together on the ramp, our legs dangling, our backs slick with sweat. A priest passed below us, flanked by guards, his robes gleaming in the fading light. He didn't look up, none of them ever did. They spoke only to the architects, the overseers, the scribes. To the rest of us, they gave silence, as if we were the scaffolding beneath their prayers. Sephi leaned toward me. "Do you think they'll let us watch it?" he whispered. I didn't answer at first. I wasn't sure. Part of me thought yes, that we would be granted the honor of seeing the golden capstone set. Watching the final seal placed atop the monument we had carved from sweat and time. But another part of me knew that sometimes the ones who do the work are not the ones invited to the ceremony. I looked at him. "We'll see it," I said. "Even if they don't let us near, we'll be close enough." He nodded and leaned, back on his elbows, gazing up at the peak. "It doesn't look finished," he murmured. "It still looks like it's growing." And he was right. Even as it neared completion, the pyramid felt alive, as if it were still reaching, still unfolding into something bigger than shape or stone. As maybe it always would. That night, after the meal, a few of us gathered at the edge of camp where the sand dipped down into the brush. A man had brought a small drumma, shallow goatskin thing. He tapped with his fingers in slow rhythm. Another sang. A woman's name. A memory. A story of a river that dried too soon. The firelight caught on their faces, and for a moment, we weren't workers or builders or forgotten men. We were simply people who had survived another day. I stayed behind after they drifted off to sleep, sat on the rock ledge, watching the pyramid glow faintly in the moonlight. The stars were clear tonight, sharp, cold, indifferent. But the pyramid looked different now. Not as a tomb, not as a monument, but as a gathering of hands. 1,000 hands, lifting one dream, one breath. At a time, I thought again of my family. Of my father's old sandals, the way his feet used to drag in the dust after the harvest. Of my mother's voice singing in the kitchen. Of the quiet sadness in my brother's eyes when I left. I whispered their names, slowly, into the dark. Not because I believed the gods were listening, but because I wanted the pyramid to remember. I don't remember the first stone I laid, not exactly. I've tried, but the days have blended into one long chain of movement. One link after another, pulled tight across the years. I know it was small, a starter block, a simple cut. The way my hands trembled, how the overseer stood just behind me, arms folded, saying nothing. I remember thinking that the stone would outlive me, that somewhere, someday, someone would run their fingers over it and feel nothing, just a smooth corner in a sea of corners. They wouldn't know my name, wouldn't care who placed it, but they'd touch what I touched. And somehow, that felt like enough. This morning I woke late. The horn had already sounded, but no one called for me. No one knocked. The mat beneath me was stiff, and the sunlight came through the reeds in broken ribbons, falling across my chest. In golden bars, my body didn't resist the delay. It welcomed it. It knew something I didn't, that this day would be different. When I finally stood, the camp was mostly empty. Only a few men remained behind, ill or assigned to lesser tasks. I found Sephi near the edge of the latrine trench, mending the strap on his tool belt with frayed linen. He looked up and grinned, wiping his hands on his knees. "You sleep through the trumpet?" he asked. I shrugged. Didn't feel like it was for me today. He didn't press, he knew better. We walked together, slowly down the slope toward the pyramid, though neither of us was rushing. The sand felt cooler underfoot, like the earth had exhaled in the night and left behind its breath. Above us, the pyramid stood tall, taller than ever. The capstone had been raised yesterday, though. Only a few had seen it. Sephi hadn't. I hadn't. Only the priests, the guards, the architects. But even from a distance, we could feel at the completeness. It was no longer a work in progress. It was finished, or at least it wanted us to believe it was. I was sent to the base platform where older blocks were being cleaned, repaired, realigned. It was humble work. It didn't matter. I no longer worked for pride. I worked because I didn't know what else to do. I moved slowly, adjusting joints, brushing away sand, sealing cracks with clay paste and powdered stone. The heat was milder than usual. Or maybe I had simply adapted. Pain no longer registered the way it used to. It wasn't pain. It was the background of my life. Around midday, a priest passed nearby, escorted by 2 guards. He glanced at us as he walked freely. Looked, not with contempt, not with superiority, it's just curiosity. Like he had never imagined that builders had faces. His eyes lingered on Sephi, then on me. Then he turned and walked on. The dust of his sandals curled in the air, gold-threaded linen flashing in the sun. "You think they'll ever tell our stories?" Sephi asked. I smiled. "Only if they forget their own." He chewed on that, then laughed. "Then we'll be remembered forever." We worked through the afternoon, but slower. There was no urgency anymore. The pyramid was done. All that remained were the edges, the polishing, the cleaning, the silent rituals of closure. We were like undertakers now, preparing the final wrappings for a body already buried. The blocks shone in the light, smooth as bone. You could see your reflection in some of them. I caught sight of mine and barely recognized it. When the horn sounded at sunset, no one rushed to leave. We lingered, standing on the scaffold beams, gazing up at the capstone. It caught the light just so like a piece of the sun had been chipped away and set atop the world. One of the younger men murmured, "A prayer, not loudly, just enough for the wind to carry." I didn't know the words. They were old, older than the priests. Older than stone, they came from the time before memory. I let them pass over me like smoke. That night, the camp was restless. Not loud, just unsettled. It's a kind of silence that comes after a story ends, but before anyone stands up. Some men laughed too loudly at jokes. Others stared too long into the fire. One man sat carving lines into a scrap of wood, not speaking to anyone. I watched them all and wondered what we would become now. The pyramid was finished. The work was done. And yet we were still here, muscles twitching, hands restless, eyes searching the horizon for something to carry. I didn't sleep right away. Walked alone for a while, down toward the river. It was quiet there. The moon shimmered on the water. Frogs called from the reeds. I sat on the bank and removed my sandals, letting the cool mud seep between my toes. I hadn't done that since I was a boy. It felt strange, beautiful, sad. I thought of my mother again, of her hands, of her laugh, of the way she used to press her palm against my forehead and whisper, "You're still here," as if presence itself was something to be checked for. To be earned, I whispered the words to myself now, quietly. "You're still here, not strong, not perfect, but here." And then, finally, I stood and walked back toward camp, leaving a trail of damp footprints in the sand. The days after the capstone felt strange, hollow, like a song with no more verses, still echoing in the ears. The horns still blew each morning. The workers still rose. But the rhythm had changed, lighter yet unmoored. We were no longer building. We were finishing, tidying, brushing, polishing. The pyramid was no longer a dream in progress. It had become a fact, and facts once settled no longer need you. I walked slower now, not out of weariness, though it still lived in every muscle, but because I was waiting for something, for someone to say, "You may go. The work is done. You can return home now." But no one did. So I kept going. This morning I was assigned to the ceremonial ramp, the great path used for final processions, lined with limestone and carved. With symbols most of us couldn't read, it was quiet there. The priests had come and gone already, leaving behind smudged footprints and the scent of incense that clung to the stone like oil. My job was to clear the joints of debris, wash the pathway with water, and check the edge stones for cracks. The kind of work that didn't ask much of the body, but asked everything of the heart. It was here that the king had been carried, his body wrapped in linen, masked in gold, flanked by chanting priests and wailing women. I hadn't seen it, but I had heard the stories. The wails, they said, echoed through the desert for hours. Some of the men said even the jackals paused to listen, that the pyramid had glowed, that the air had stilled, that the king's soul rose like smoke and settled atop the capstone, watching. But for me it was just stone, cold, quiet, waiting. Worked alone, I liked it that way. With no one around, I could speak softly to the pyramid, not in words, but in thoughts. I imagined it listening, remembering. I told it about my sister's child, born the year the first stones were placed, about the bird that used to nest outside my family's hut, about a girl I had once kissed under a fig tree, about the man I had become without noticing. When the sun climbed high, I stopped for a while, sat in the shade of a column, and sipped from my jug. The water was warm, but it steadied me. I pressed my forehead against the stone and felt its weight. Just heavy. It was patient. It would outlast the Nile, the priests, even the name of the king buried within. It would wait for the sand to rise, for the wind to grind its corners smooth, for travelers to stumble upon it and wonder who had built it and why they would ask. But they would never know our names. Sephi found me in the afternoon. He was grinning, eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in weeks. "They're sending people home," he said, bit by bit, one crew at a time. I nodded slowly. "And us soon, maybe tomorrow." That word hung between us. Tomorrow, a promise, a warning. Back at camp, the fires burned lower than usual. The cooks had made stouker than we were used to. A farewell meal, some said. Others just shrugged. I sat near the edge of camp with Sephi and an older man named Meanies, who had worked. On the interior corridors, he was missing 3 fingers on his right hand, lost in a scaffolding collapse years ago. Still, he tied better knots than any of us. He was the kind of man who didn't speak unless it mattered. That night, he spoke. "I used to believe the pyramid was a stairway," he said, staring into his bowl. "A path for the dead to climb. Now I think it's a cage." We waited. He continued, "Not for us. For memory, they build it to trap time, so no one forgets the king, or the gods, or this place." but it traps us too. We're inside it now. Even when we leave, no one answered. What could we say? The wind picked up that night, cold and dry. I pulled my tunic tighter and lay back on my mat, staring at the stars. I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling the same thought. What would tomorrow look like without the work? Who was I without the stone? They came in the morning, 3 scribes, an overseer, and a man none of us recognized, wearing robes dyed with a pale blue, rarely seen in these parts. The color of papyrus flowers, of river water in spring. He read from a scroll, carefully. Slowly, our names, group by group, not all at once. The pyramid would not be abandoned. Skeleton crew would remain, some by duty, some by choice, some because they had nowhere else to go. My name was near the end of the list. Sephi's came just before mine. When we heard it, we looked at each other for a long time, then nodded. Nothing needed to be said. We were going home, but where was that now? The morning passed in a haze. I tried to work, but the tools felt different. In my hands lighter, as if they no longer trusted me. Stones no longer looked familiar. I polished a small joint on the south ramp, knowing I would never see it again. I pressed my palm to it, leaving a faint smear of sweat and dust. It vanished quickly. The stone didn't care. It never had. It was both its cruelty and its comfort. We were told to return to camp by midday. The ox carts would arrive soon. They would take us to the river, where boats waited to carry us north, or east, or west. Home meant different things to different men. For some, it was a village of 4 huts and a fig tree. For others, a city of 10,000, noisy with trade and heat and color. For me, I wasn't sure anymore. Sephi was folding his tunic when I entered the hut. He looked up, smiling faintly. You ready? I sat beside him and picked at the worn fabric of my sash. I don't know, are you? He shrugged. I don't remember the road back. It's just that I came down at once. That stayed with me. I came down at once. It's like a dream you only remember the end of. I tied my pack shut and looked around the room. The mat, the cracked bowl, the soot stain. On the ceiling, it's all of it insignificant, and yet more familiar than the home I had left. Outside, the carts arrived, creaking wheels. Dust rising around the hooves of thick-legged oxen, the drivers silent and solemn. They had done this before. It carried men away who had forgotten how to be men. We loaded up in silence. I sat beside Sephi, our knees pressed together. He carried a small pouch, his mother's charm, the one he'd given me, tied back with twine. I saw it in his hand, and for a moment, I thought he'd offer it back, but he didn't. And I didn't ask. As the cart pulled away, I turned to look behind us. The pyramid filled the sky. It looked different from this angle, softer somehow. Less like a wound in the earth, and more like a tooth, planted deep, unmoving. Around it, the workers who remained looked up briefly. Some waved. Most didn't. The priests walked along the southern edge, their robes fluttering, their chants low and endless. The wind carried the sound only briefly, then lost it in the dunes. The road away from the pyramid was not smooth. The cart jolted. Dust filled our eyes, but I did not cover my face. I wanted to feel it. All of it. I had spent so long breathing it in that the thought of clean air unsettled me. We passed villages we hadn't seen in months, bright-walled homes, children playing. In the dust, dogs barking at strangers. I saw a woman baking flatbread in a clay oven. I smelled meat cooking over coals. For a moment, I thought I might weep. But I didn't. My body had forgotten how. That night, we camped by the river. The boats would come at sunrise. 15 of us in that campment who had lifted more than their share, buried friends, held ropes tight while others slipped. We didn't talk much, just sat around the fire, our backs aching even in stillness, our eyes blinking too slowly to hide our fatigue. Sephi spoke first. What if we don't remember how to be normal? A few men chuckled. One man said we're never normal. We're stonecutters, rope pullers, bone breakers. Another said we're ghosts now. It's the kind that walk in daylight. But I just looked up at the stars and said nothing, because I knew the truth. We had become the stone. We had lived inside its shadow, breathed its dust, poured our lives into its silence. Even if we walked away, part of us would stay, trapped in joints and cracks. In the breathless spaces between each block, in the curve of every forgotten ramp, the pyramid was finished. But it would always be building us. I lay down that night on the bank of the Nile. The stars shimmered. The frogs croaked. A breeze from the water passed over me like a mother's hand. I let it carry me into sleep, the kind that feels less like rest and more like remembering. And I dreamed of the pyramid again, not as a place, but as a heartbeat. Slow, steady, eternal. The boat rocked softly beneath my feet. It had been years since I'd stood on moving water. The Nile was wide and calm this time of year, surface broken only by the oars of passing traders and the long black shadows of reeds brushing the banks. I sat near the prow, wrapped in my linen tunic, knees pulled up beneath my chin. The breeze was cooler here, with the scent of life, silt, lilies, fish. It felt wrong at first. Too gentle, too clean, like the world had forgotten what we'd done. The crewmen didn't speak to us. They cast their eyes down when they passed, as if afraid of what we carried. Not disease, not injury, something else, something heavier. Maybe they had ferried pyramid workers before. Maybe they had seen too many return with hunched backs, empty stares, silence where voices should have been. Men who left part of themselves. Behind in the shadow of stone, the others sat in groups near the mast, murmuring quietly. Sephi dozed with his head on a sack of grain. His mouth twitched now and then, as though arguing with someone in a dream. I didn't disturb him. Didn't want to speak at all? Not yet. Not while the river was listening. We passed familiar landmarks, ruined columns swallowed by ivy, shrines with faded paint, villages built on mud islands that clung to the river like stubborn memories. Children waved from the banks. Old women filled their jars. A fisherman stood waist-deep in the reeds, his net slack and forgotten as he stared at our boat with an unreadable expression. I kept waiting to feel something. Joy, relief, closure. But what I felt was hollow, like a man climbing down from a scaffold after a lifetime only to realize the ground no longer knows his name. That night, we docked at a merchant's quay, just outside a town whose name I couldn't recall. The stars were out again, though they looked different this far north. They didn't seem to shimmer the same way. I ate only a little dried beans, a sliver of onion, and lay back on the dock with my hands beneath my head, staring upward, wondering if the same sky watched over the pyramid. Wondering if it missed us. Sephi joined me, lying beside me in silence for a while. Then he said, "Do you think people will climb it?" I turned my head toward him. The pyramid. He nodded. "Is it 100 years or 1,000? Do you think they'll try to reach the top?" I thought about it. "Yes," I said. "They'll climb it. They'll want to see the view. They'll want to feel taller than they are." He smiled faintly. "Out. What if they forget it was built by hands? What if they think it was always there?" "Then they'll be wrong," I said. "But the stone won't care." He nodded again, and we let the silence return. The boat took us farther north the next day. I saw hills I'd walked as a boy, cluster of palms that looked like the ones by the old temple near my father's village. Memories began to return in small, sharp bursts, flashes of scent and sound. The way oil hissed in the pan, the creak of the market gate, the high laugh of my cousin when she found a frog in her grain sack, and then, by late afternoon, we docked again. The last time, Sephi stepped off first, turning in a slow circle like a dog sniffing the edges of a new den. I followed him. My legs wobbled, not from the boat, but from the absence of stone. For years I had walked with weight in my spine. That weight was gone, and my body didn't know how to carry nothing. There were people waiting. A few, not many. Some mothers, some brothers. A few younger children with wide eyes and baskets of dates. No music, no celebration, just reunion, quiet and unsure. A boy ran to one of the older men and wrapped his arms around his legs, laughing. The man didn't bend to meet him. He just stood there, blinking, until someone else gently guided the boy away. Sephi's sister was there. She looked older than he remembered. Her hair was longer, her face harder. But when she saw him, she ran, no hesitation, and wrapped him in both arms. I turned away to give them space. No one came for me. I hadn't expected anyone to. Walked alone up the narrow path that led into the hills, past the shrine stones and the broken fig tree, past the market gate and the cracked road where boys once ran barefoot chasing goats. Some people looked at me. A few nodded. One man asked if I needed water. I didn't answer, not out of rudeness. I just wasn't ready to hear my voice again. When I reached the place where I was born, I found it smaller than I remembered. The walls were still there, the roof sagged, but held. The fields beyond were fallow, the well covered in moss. I stepped inside the doorway and stood in the shadow of my old life. It didn't feel like home, not yet. Maybe not ever. I sat on the floor and rested my back against the wall. And for the first time in all the years since I first touched that first block, I cried. Not loud, not broken. Just slow, steady tears, falling onto my palms like soft rain on stone. The days passed quietly, not with purpose, but with weight. Heavy, like a pot that no longer holds anything but is too large to put aside. I rose each morning as I always had, before the sun had fully opened its eye over the hills. Because I needed to. There were no horns here, no foreman calling my name. But because the rhythm had been etched into my bones too deeply to forget. My village had not changed much, but I had. I walked through it as a stranger. The women watched me pass. With wary eyes, the children kept their distance. Some recognized me. Others thought I was a traveler. One man said, I looked like a soldier returned from a war no one remembered. I didn't correct him. The field behind the house was overgrown. I tried to work it on the third day, clearing weeds, testing the irrigation trench, digging with a wooden hoe I found hanging behind the shed, but my hands rebelled. They were stiff, shaped now for stone, not soil. I tore blisters before the morning was done and sat on the edge of the field, breath shallow, forehead wet with something that wasn't sweat that night. I dreamed of the ramp again. But this time, I was alone on it, walking upward, with no block. Behind me, and no voices ahead. The ramp twisted as it rose, higher and higher, until I reached the top only, to find there was no capstone, just an empty space where it should have been. A void, and from it, a wind blew that smelled of salt and fire. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, hand gripping the reed mat beneath me. I didn't sleep again that night. Sefi sent a message by runner a few days later. He'd returned to his family's home near the river delta. His sister had given him a small plot of land. He was learning to fish. It's harder than I expected, he wrote. Nothing holds still. I missed the way stone listened when you touched it. I stared at the words for a long time, and folded them and tucked them into the sleeve of my robe. I would not write back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not because I didn't care. Because the silence between us had become holy. I walked the village road that afternoon. The sun was kind. The wind carried the scent of wild barley. An old woman called to me as I passed her house. She needed help lifting a jug. I did so without speaking, and when I handed it to her, she said, "Your shoulders are different. Like someone tried to carve them into something." I thanked her with a nod and walked on. Later, I passed the shrine near the edge of town. One carved into the stone wall, half sunk into the earth, where people left offerings for the river spirits. I hadn't visited it in years, not since I was a boy. I stood there a while, staring at the faded glyphs, the broken clay figures, the withered bundles of herbs, and then, without knowing why, I knelt not to pray, not to ask, but just to remember what it felt like to bow. The days continued. Quiet still, I spoke little. I ate less. My muscles softened, but the aches remained. My dreams grew stranger. Sometimes I saw the pyramid underwater, its edges rippling like fish scales. Other nights, I walked through its corridors endlessly, unable to find the exit, the walls whispering in a language older than breath. People began to avoid me more openly, not out of cruelty, but out of confusion. I was a man who had touched eternity and returned untouched. They didn't know what to do with me. One morning a boy followed me as I walked to the well. He couldn't have been more than 8, barefoot, thin arms. "Curious eyes, did you build the pyramid?" he asked. I didn't answer at first. He asked again, "Did you really carry the stones?" I stopped, turned, looked at him, yes. I said, "Every day." He squinted. "Was it hard?" "Yes," I said again, and beautiful, and awful, and long. He nodded, then asked the one question no one else had dared to ask me. Was it worth it? I looked away, to the horizon, to the road, to the sky. Then I said, "Ask me again in another lifetime." The boy never asked again. I saw him sometimes at the edge of the market or crouched by the stream where the goats drank. He watched me with quiet eyes, never speaking, just observing, as if waiting for me to return to stone. Maybe I already had. Maybe the man who had come back from the pyramid was only a shadow, flickering across a wall that no longer needed light. I tried farming again. I dug with my left hand, holding the hoe with the right, switching every hour. My grip slipped. Often, I cursed myself for how clumsy I had become with things that grew. The soil didn't feel right. It's too soft. It didn't resist like stone, didn't speak the same language. A furrow was not the same as a groove. Seed not the same as a carved joint. Here, mistakes died quietly. They didn't fall and crush your ribs. They just failed to bloom. I began to walk more. Long walks, beyond the village, into the hills. The paths were worn but empty. I followed them until the wind changed, until the sun slid from one shoulder to the other, until the shadows grew thin. I spoke aloud sometimes, not because I expected an answer, but because silence became unbearable. I named stones. I named trees. I told the cliffs about the men who had died hauling granite. I told the clouds about the boy who had once dropped a mallet and wept because he thought he'd been cursed. And sometimes, when I found the edge of a tall ridge, I stood and stared into the distance, expecting to see it, the pyramid. But it was never there, too far, too buried in heat and memory. Still, I saw it in my mind. As clearly as I saw my own hands, one evening, I came home to find a small wrapped bundle at my door. Inside, a piece of dry bread, a folded note, and a redrawing of a pyramid with a face beside it. No name, just the image. I placed it on the ledge above the hearth and left it there. I did not eat the bread. No, I did not read the note. I only stared at the drawing for a long while, wondering how the child who drew it saw Uzmi, the pyramid, which was older, which was stronger. Weeks passed, seasons hinted at change. The fields shifted color. Rain came once, washing the dust from rooftops, stirring the scent of wet clay into the air. I stood in the open and let it fall on me without flinching. It felt like a gift from a god I no longer remembered. And then, one night the dream came. Again this time, sharper, colder. I was inside the pyramid, but I wasn't walking. I was part of it. A stone, a polished block in a chamber. No one visited. I could hear voices above me, priests chanting, scribes scratching at the walls, but I could not see. I could not move. I was just there, waiting. When I woke, the mat beneath me was soaked. My back ached worse than it had in months. I sat up, shaking, and whispered aloud, "I don't belong here." But where did I belong? I began writing then, scratching small symbols onto bits of wood, broken pottery, old cloth. Not full thoughts, not proper words, just pieces of things, names, shapes, numbers. Traced the outline of the pyramid again, and again drew the scaffolding, the ramps, the joints. I didn't care if anyone read it. It wasn't for them. It was for the part of me that had stayed behind. At the edge of the village was an old man named Haru. He had been a potter once, until his fingers curled inward and refused to open. Now he just sat outside his hut, grinding herbs into dust and telling stories to anyone who'd listen. Most people ignored him, said he was touched by spirits. But one day he called to me. "You walk like your bones are heavier than your skin." He said. I stopped, said nothing. He gestured to the stool beside him. I sat. "You built the pyramid," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. He nodded. "They say it's perfect. Is it?" I thought a long while before answering. Then said, "It's as perfect as tired hands could make it." He smiled. "That's the only kind of perfection that matters." We sat for a while. He ground leaves. I watched the dust blow in the wind. "You're not done," he said at last. "With what?" "With building. You've just forgotten what the next thing is." The words of the old man stayed with me. I carried them around like I once carried rope looped loosely in my mind, tugged tight when the day grew still. "You're not done." I didn't know what he meant at first. Maybe I did, but I was afraid to admit it, because when the work ends and you're still standing, you have to ask what you're standing for. The next morning, I didn't go to the field. I didn't walk to the market. I sat by the stream behind my home and waited for the water to speak. It said nothing. It only passed slow, unbothered, reflecting clouds I didn't recognize. I picked up a handful of pebbles and ran them through. My fingers, round, soft, forgiving. Nothing like the blocks I once polished. But in their silence I heard the same thing. Continue. That evening, I took the broken reed mats from the storehouse and laid them out in the corner of my home. I trimmed the edges. I rewove what I could. Then I did the same with the next mat and the next. By moonrise, I had 6 repaired. My fingers ached, but the ache was good. Not the ache of hauling or hammering, but of shaping, guiding. Slow work, but it was mine. The next day, I mended the cooking shelf. Then, I cleaned the stones in the courtyard, brushing dirt from between the joints, just as I had at the base of the pyramid. The rhythm came back without effort. Brush, press, breathe. I sang a little under my breath, a song I hadn't sung since I was a boy. No one heard. I didn't need them to. People began to notice. A woman stopped by holding a broken stool. "Could you fix this?" she asked. I took it, repaired it, turned it the next day. A man brought a water jug with a crack in the handle. "You worked with stone. Maybe you're good with clay, too." I wasn't, but I tried. I remade the handle. It held. More came, quietly, not with ceremony, just need. And I worked not because I owed them, not because I was told to, but because my hands remembered how to build. They didn't care if it was a tomb or a table. And slowly, the village began to see me again, not as a stranger returned from silence, but as someone present, someone real. The boy who once asked me about the pyramid returned. This time he didn't ask questions, simply brought a basket of reeds and sat beside me. I showed him how to strip them clean, how to braid them tight, watched, listened, then tried it himself. He failed the first few times. I didn't correct him. He learned. "You miss it," he asked once. "The pyramid." He nodded. I stared. Ahead at the hills, where the wind drew lines in the grass. "No," I said. "I don't miss the stone. But I miss the silence it gave me." "What do you mean it listened?" I said. "Better than most people ever will." He thought about that, then nodded, as if he understood. In time, others came to watch, then to help. They brought old tools, broken rope, dull knives. Taught them what I could. Not like a priest, not like a master, just one hand showing another where to press. And so I built again. Not monuments, not tombs. It's pattern, presence, presence. I began to laugh more. Not loudly, not often, but enough. I even sang once while digging a new trench for the well. One of the women joined in. The others clapped in rhythm. It felt foolish. And holy then. One day I climbed the hill behind the village, not for work, not for anything, just to stand, just to look. And there, in the distance, far beyond the curve of the desert, I saw it, faint, pale, like a tooth on the edge of the world, the pyramid still. Standing, still watching. I didn't bow, I didn't cry, only raised my hand and whispered, "I'm still building," turned away. The first rain of the new season came gently, not the kind that washes roads away, not the kind that makes the hills collapse. Oh, this was different, soft, slow, like breath-warming cold skin. The air filled with the scent of roots and damp leaves and the hidden freshness buried beneath dust. I stepped out into it without covering my head. It had been years since I let myself get wet without worry. The drops clung to my face like blessings. By morning, everything looked new. The walls, the ground, even the sky felt scrubbed clean. The villagers moved slower that day, not from laziness, from reverence. Rain changes things here. Reminds you that the world can give back. The boy returned that afternoon, the one who used to ask about the pyramid. His name was Kafir, I had learned. His mother had passed the year before. His father had not returned from conscription. He brought with him another basket of reeds, this one woven better than before. I did it tighter this time, he said. Like you showed me. Took it in my hands, ran my thumb along the weave. It was strong, uneven in places, but honest. I nodded. Good. He grinned, then set it down, and sat beside me in the shade. We didn't speak for a while, just worked him. With a small carving knife, trimming edges, me patching a cracked bench for one of the elders. It was good work, quiet, the kind that didn't demand explanation. After a time, he said, "Did you ever want to stop?" Stop what? Working, hauling, polishing, building. I thought about it, yes, I said every day, especially in the middle. That's when it feels the most endless. Why didn't you? I placed the last wooden peg into the joint and hammered it gently with a stone. The sound echoed once, then died, because someone had to finish it. He nodded, not in awe, but in understanding. He was growing up faster than I had. Maybe I had just taken longer to notice the world. As the days turned, others joined us. Not many, just a few. A man whose tools I had repaired. A girl who wanted to learn how to bind thread. A woman who offered me goat's milk in exchange for help with her doorframe. They didn't come like students. They came like neighbors. I didn't become a teacher. I became a rhythm. It's the one steady thing in a place where time often frayed. I started to mark the days again, not with chalk or string or priestly charts, but with acts. One pot repaired, one reed bundle braided, one seed planted. Was enough. That was more than enough, chap. Brought me news sometimes from the river, of travelers who passed by, stories whispered by boatmen, he said one man claimed to have. Seen the pyramid from a great distance, and that it still looked unfinished, that the gods had not yet descended, that the capstone was hollow and would one day open. I smiled when he said that. Do you think that's true? I think, I said, that anything built by men will always seem incomplete to those who didn't build it. He seemed to like that. Wrote it down later on a piece of bark, careful with each stroke of the reed pen I had lent him. I never asked what he planned to do with the words. I didn't need to know. One day Haru, the old potter, passed. Quietly. In his sleep, they buried him behind his hut, near the acacia tree he'd planted when his wife died. I helped build the marker, just a flat stone, carved with a single spiral. No names, no dates. Just the shape of time turning inward. At the burial, the villagers stood in silence. Someone began to hum an old temple melody I hadn't heard since I was a boy. I found myself joining in, not with voice, with breath, with posture, with presence. Night, I sat by my fire with Kefier nearby, the air thick with smoke and new stars. He asked if I'd ever build again. Really build. With stone, with shape, vision. I thought about it, then I said yes, but not what they built before. Then I looked at him. People. And he nodded, and we began again. The season changed without ceremony. The winds shifted slightly. The sun returned later in the morning. The birds began their migration over the hills, their formations sharp as chisels against the blue sky. No one announced it. It like a joint tightening before the pull. With the change came a feeling I had almost forgotten. Momentum. Not the kind that drags a sled up a ramp, the kind that grows quietly in the chest, kind that doesn't ask for praise. It was in the way people stepped into the courtyard now without hesitation, in how children ran barefoot through the dust where once I had stood alone. In how Kefia no longer waited to be invited, he simply arrived. He brought with him a friend, a girl named Nahari. She was taller than him by a hand and sharper with her tongue. She corrected him often, but gently. She could weave tighter and faster than either of us. She had a way of looking at wood that made the old pieces straighten themselves. When I first met her, she asked only one thing. "Is this place for building?" Nodded, "Only if you stay long enough." And she did. So we began again. Not with blueprints, not with stone. Someone needed a stronger ladder to reach the date palms. Someone else needed storage for grain. Nahari asked if she could build a loom. I asked her if she had ever built one. She shrugged. Not yet. That was answer enough. I showed them. How to draw straight lines in the dirt. How to measure using rope. How to brace a frame before you trust it. They listened, and then they argued, and then they tried. That was how it should be. The pyramid had taught me that. Nothing worth placing lasts, unless you've failed first in the attempt. Word spread slowly, not like rumors, but like roots quiet and steady. A man from across the valley brought broken wheels. A traveler left behind a cracked knife and 3 copper nails as payment for a repaired yoke. We began to trade not for coin, but for story. One man gave a song in exchange for a bench. Another gave a basket of dried figs and offered to teach Kafir the names of the stars. I kept working, not because I needed to. It's because it made the days make sense. In the evenings, we sat by the fire not to forget the day, but to remember it. Together, there was no temple, no scrolls. But the work had become worship in its own way. Kafir asked fewer questions now. Nahari asked more. I answered only when the silence didn't say enough on its own. Sometimes I walked the fields at dusk, watching the shadows grow long, remembering how the pyramid's edge would stretch across the desert at that hour. I thought often about the men I had left behind, the ones still placing blocks, the ones who would never leave the shadow. I wondered what they were building now, not with tools, with memory, with time. I received a message one morning carried by a merchant boy from the south. Sefi had taken work as a boatman, ferrying travelers from city to village. He had learned the stars, he wrote, and now navigated by memory. I still carry the rope, he said. It's not because I need it, but because I remember what it taught my hands. I read the letter aloud to the fire. No one interrupted. We let the words settle into the ashes that night. Nahari asked if I missed the pyramid. No, I said. Yeah, but I miss what it asked of me. What was that? Everything, she nodded. That's what good things ask. The wind changed. Again, this time, it brought the scent of river mud. The sound of far-off hooves, the feeling of something closing gently behind you. I knew the season was ending, not just the one of weather, but of something deeper. A season of returning, of remembering, of rebuilding. The work, I realized, was done, not because there was nothing left to fix, but because I had finally placed the last block, and this one was inside me. The courtyard had changed since the day I first swept it alone. Now, benches lined the walls. Tools hung neatly in a row. Reed mats shaded the entry. Small hands worked beside mine, and laughter lived where dust once. Settled, Nahari had built her loom. She sat at it most mornings now, threading blue and brown cloth like she was stitching time together. Kefir had carved a bird into the frame. Didn't look like much, but it stayed. Permanence was never in perfection, it was in presence. People came and went freely now. Some brought broken things, some brought nothing. Some came only to sit. They said the place made them feel calm, like it remembered them, like it asked nothing but honesty. And maybe that was true. I had become a quiet figure in their stories. The man who returned from stone is the one who walked like memory. They didn't know the full truth, and I never gave it to them. I didn't need to. The pyramid had taught me that legacy isn't what you tell people. It's what they carry when you leave. One evening, I stood at the edge of the village with Kafir. The wind was soft, and the sun folded itself over the hills like cloth. He was taller now, his voice deeper, his eyes steadier. He asked, "Will you ever go back?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "No, not with my feet." He frowned. "But you still think about it?" "Yes," I said, I always will. Looked ahead, toward the hills where the horizon turned gold. I think I want to build something too, something that lasts. Will. How do you know? Because you already started. You stood there until the stars came. He pointed at the belt of Orion, tracing the arc with his finger. Remembered hauling stones beneath that same constellation. I wondered how many men had done the same lifted burdens under those silent witnesses. Never knowing they were being watched by eternity, that night, I lit one final fire. Just me. I sat alone and watched the flames curl around the kindling. Watched the light flicker across my hands, these hands that had once gripped ropes, shaped blocks, wiped sweat from the brow of dying friends. Now they were still, and that was all. Right. I whispered the names of those I remembered. Not loudly, just enough for the wind to carry. And then I lay back on the earth, folded my arms behind my head, and looked at the sky. The pyramid would stand forever, but I was here, breathing alive, and still building, not of stone, but of time. And that too would last.